Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our CCU President's Webinar on Race and Ethnicity. So glad you're with us. We're coming to you tonight from Colorado Christian University. And this is a series of 3 webinars held on this broad topic. This is the second of the 3. And it all came to be because of the events of this summer and the issues behind it that we've thought about for a long time, but they came very much to our attention because of the racial unrest and because of our commitment to liberty and justice for all and our commitment to Christ and the gospel. We wanted to create some space to proactively think about issues of race and ethnicity from a Christian worldview. Now, normally these would be in person and they would be on our campus, but because of COVID and all the challenges of this year, we've decided to do some of these through webinar, which is actually an opportunity because it enables more people to join us and we can invite our guests and they don't have to go through all the hassle of travel. Let me tell you a little bit about our guest tonight. Dr. Robert L. Woodson Sr. is the president of the Woodson Center. He is author of many books. He's one of the original civil rights leaders. Bob, it's an honor to have you with us tonight. Dr. Woodson founded the Woodson Center in 1981 to help residents of low-income neighborhoods address the problems of their communities. He is a former civil rights activist. He has headed the National Urban League, the Department of Criminal Justice, their division there. He's been a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Foundation for Public Policy Research. He is referred affectionately by many as the godfather of neighborhood empowerment, that movement where he's given his life to it over 4 decades. Dr. Woodson has had a special concern for the problems of youth and criminal justice, and especially the epidemic of youth violence that has afflicted urban, rural, and suburban neighborhoods alike. He is an early MacArthur Genius Awardee and the recipient of the 2008 Bradley Prize, the President's Citizens Award, a 2008 Social Entrepreneurship Award from the Manhattan Institute. Dr. Woodson appears in the news regularly. I'm sure you've seen him on the pages of the Wall Street Journal or on C-SPAN or Fox or many other news outlets. So it's a special treat. Bob, welcome.
Can you hear me all right now?
Now I can hear you. Great.
Good. It's just pleased to be back on campus, at least virtually anyway. After spending a few years on your board of directors, just pleased to be here again, participating in a CCU event.
Well, thank you, Bob. You had a long time connection with CCU. I knew you were a good friend of former President Bill Armstrong. We had the privilege of serving on the board for a while, and it's wonderful to have you as on our advisory committee as a university. But thank you for taking your time. Most of all, we are thrilled to have you.
Okay.
Bob, tell us briefly about the mission and work of the Woodson Center.
The Woodson Center is a national not-for-profit that I founded 39 years ago, headquartered in Washington, D.C. And its mission really is to assist low-income grassroots leaders, people living in high-crime, drug-infested neighborhoods, to begin to craft solutions from within those communities to the problems of poverty and disinvestment. And we do so, we have about 2,500 low-income leaders in 39 states. And we apply the principles that operate in our market economy to addressing poverty. In other words, only 3% of the people who are entrepreneurs in our market economy generate 70% of the jobs. That's because it only takes a small percentage of entrepreneurs to generate wealth and well-being for a number of people. Well, the same principle applies in low-income crime-ridden neighborhoods, that there are people living there who are in poverty but not of poverty. If we say that 70% of low-income families are raising children or dysfunctional, it means that 30% are not, and they are the social entrepreneurs. So we go in and find these social entrepreneurs, and we're sort of like a venture capitalist without capital. we actually help them to grow and to prosper, and so that what works for a few can blossom into an entire neighborhood and an entire community. So we rebuild low-income communities by dealing with the moral and spiritual infrastructure, and then we recruit secular financial and technical support to help these entities grow.
What prompted you to start it?
Well, I was a little frustrated because first I was a social activist in the 60s, having led demonstrations and whatnot. And I realized that a lot of the problems that we were facing were policy obstacles. And so then I left and became a part of the think tank community. But I took my practical activist experience to the American Enterprise Institute, where I was fortunate to know how one begins to address policies changes. But then I realized in think tanks, you're not supposed to do very much, but think about the problems and write about them. So I sort of had a glass ceiling experience. And I said, you know, the answer really lies in between the two. So right. I started the Woodson Center that acts as an intermediary between the streets and the suites. Between policymakers and activists. So I want policy to be informed by actions of people rather than people always responding to policy initiatives coming from on high.
Well, I love the fact that you're a practitioner and a thoughtful practitioner. One of my favorite scenes in a movie is Indiana Jones, the first movie, and remember, he was the archaeologist, but he would leave the classroom and go out in the field for an adventure, and he'd come back. He lived in that middle world, which I think you have too.
I really have, because the problems of poverty in America have been, I've seen it close, but also was frustrated by the traditional approaches to poverty. And so I've been an antagonist to the traditional $22 trillion that the government has spent over the past 60 years to create, I say create poverty, in fact it has. Thomas Sowell argues in the Black community that between 1940 and 1940, the poverty rate in Black America was like 80%, but it declined to about 25% in the 1960s. So there was the largest decline in poverty occurred between 1940 and 1960. But then with the poverty programs, it plateaued for another 50 years.
Wow.
So if the government had just left folks alone, poverty would have continued to decline. And so that, and the reason for the interruption of this natural process of poverty reduction is really the motivation for most of my work now, because we really have injured a lot of poor people in the name of saving them.
Mm. You were, when you were involved in the civil rights movement back in the 60s, you actually met Martin Luther King shortly before he died. Is that right?
Yes, I did. See, the way the civil rights movement was organized, Dr. King and Barrett, I did my civil rights work in Westchester, Pennsylvania. It's a town about 30 miles west of Philadelphia, in Delaware County. And that's the birthplace of Barrett Rustin. I knew his whole family. And so Barrett Rustin and Dr. King would come through, and because they're national figures, they would draw the press. And then those of us that were local leaders had an opportunity to present our grievance. And so when they left town, it drew attention to us. And as a consequence, that's how the civil rights movement, but they were always supportive of local issues. The civil rights movement wasn't just some national movement, but it empowered us locally to begin to address the problems of racism and discrimination in our local community. But I met him about 3 months before he died.
There have been numerous events that have sparked protest over race in the last number of years. When I lived in Florida, we lived close to Sanford, where Trayvon Martin was shot. And this summer it was the death of George Floyd, which sparked protests, followed by rioting. And one of the claims continually made, and it's a question, it raises a question in students' mind, is America, when we see all these events, is America a racist nation? And I'm sure you get that question all the time, but how do you answer that?
Well, first of all, I think we have to understand, go back and realize what is going on today. The reality is, in the course of a year, there are about 1,000 people who are shot by the police. Only 14 of those shot by the police are unarmed Black folks. 14. But because we have racialized, we have now defined the police as agents of white supremacy. Anytime you have an incident of police shooting, it's promoted into a national crisis. And a lot of misinformation pervades the whole issue. The very fact that Kamala Harris at the Democratic National Convention could say, you know, name Trayvon Martin and name it, and the list goes on and on. And Michelle Obama made the same mistake in saying, oh, the list goes on. No, it's 14. For every one Black shot by an unarmed Black shot by a police officer, 270 Blacks are shot and killed by other Blacks. But this is something that we don't pay attention. You got to understand what is going on here is that there are forces on the left who are using our tortured racial past. I say slavery, for instance, is America's birth defect, but it does not define who we are. How many of us want to be defined by what we used to do when we were young, or the most foolish thing we did when America is a country of redemption, and redemption is the heart and soul of America. But this history of redemption and the making of and the American ideals are being hijacked by forces on the left, Black Lives Matter and others. They're taking America's racial past and weaponizing it and using it to undermine the institutions of our society, civil institutions. Because if you look at George Floyd, people right and left of center were horrified to see this man die the way he did. It was a consensus. There's no political posturing on this. But Black Lives Matter shows up, robed in the cloak of civil rights righteousness, and they led peaceful demonstrations. And then the radical left come in and turn peaceful protest into violent assault on the institutions of our society. And so they migrated from justice for Blacks to assault on burning the Bibles in Portland. They said that the Christian cross is a symbol of white supremacy. The statues of even Frederick Douglass in Rochester, New York were torn down. You see, what they have done is they have migrated beyond social justice for Blacks, but they're using it to attack the fundamental institutions of civil society. That's really what's going on here.
So you wouldn't take issue with the fact that racism is still a problem in parts of America, right? I mean,
right. No, it is a problem, Don, not
yeah,
the most important problem.
yeah,
And
yeah,
but the people on the left try to act as if America is incurably racist, and that that all white people are villains and all white people are victims. I mean, all blacks are victims.
yeah.
And they use terms like institutional racism. I don't know what that is.
Hmm. You were you in your organization, the Woodson Center. You have responded to something that came out of the New York Times, where they started a project called the 1619 Project to sort of tell the story of America's founding, but from the perspective of slavery, and sort of now saying America is hopelessly racist, and this narrative should reframe our understanding of everything. I know you take issue with that, and I want to hear your critique of it, and then also hear a little bit about your response through the Woodson Center with the 1776.
Well, those essays in the summer of 2019 by Nicole Hannah-Jones, and what she did was assembled a group of Black journalists and artists and others, and they published a series of essays, and they are trying to redefine America as fundamentally its birthday should not be 1776, but 1619. That's the day when the first 20 Black slaves, African slaves, actually they were indentured servants when they got here, and most of them got their freedom within a few years. But that's another reality. But nevertheless, they said as a consequence, and also the founding fathers, half of them were slave owners, and because of their actions were unworthy of the principles that they articulate, therefore the document that they wrote, the Declaration of Independence, is therefore invalid. And we reject that. And so then they said their conclusion is America is that racism is in America's DNA, which means you can't change it. It's in your DNA. And therefore, all white people have suffered, they have privilege, power, and influence and privilege, and therefore they should be punished. And all Black people are victims, and they should be compensated. And they even scholars left and right of center, the American Socialist Unit, challenged the veracity of these statements that were written. It is false, saying that the Revolutionary War was fought to protect slavery when some of the colonies had already ended slavery. So it really has provoked an outpouring of challenge by historians, noted historians, both left and right of center. And so it tries to recast America as incurably racist. And so what we did was, and since they were using the Black community as the bludgeon to denigrate the founding principles, we believe the messenger should be Black as well. That's why I've brought together at the Woodson Center maybe 20 to 23 Black scholars. But like the Civil Rights Coalition, it's led by Blacks, but we have whites and others who are joined us. But we are not there to offer an alternative debate, but we're offering an alternative narrative. We've also included activists as a part of it, because the problem with the current debate, it's between scholars, and people are more motivated to understand values when they see it in action. And so we have a part of our network people whose lives have been redeemed and transformed through the grace of God, because their actions of a process of redemption and transformation was built on the foundation of our founding principles of personal responsibility, of self-sacrifice, of trustworthiness, of hard work. These are all bourgeois values that have protected Blacks in the presence of oppression. But these are the same values that are denigrated by Black Lives Matter and the 1619. They're saying that to be personally responsible is to act white. That's an insult to say the
Mhm.
bourgeois values of learning to read and write and write in standard English and study Shakespeare is somehow acting white. This is an insult. And so what we have done is we have people pushing back and really challenging the lies and misinformation of 1619. Quick example, when they said that that the problems of out of wedlock births and violence today is due in large part because of legacy of slavery and discrimination. Well, we document the fact that between 1930 and 1940, when racism was enshrined in law and America was going through a depression, the unemployment rate among white America was 25%, but 40% for blacks. Even in the presence of those horrible circumstances, we have the highest marriage rate of any other group in America. Our elderly could walk safely in our communities without fear of being mugged by their grandchildren. And that's because of faith, our family, and work, those bourgeois values.
So will 1776 project be given to schools like the 1619 project?
Yes, as long as it stayed at the New York Times as a magazine insert, it was fine. But when the Pulitzer organization took it and really and made it available to all 50 states as curriculum, that's when it really became disastrous. So we said what we want to do. So we have taken our essays and we last week released our first 3 lessons from K through 12, our own curriculum that is pro-American, that is pro-truth. Don, in the first 7 days, there were 4,000 downloads of our curriculum, 4,000. When in the course of a year, 1619 had 4,500 downloads in the course of a year, but we had 4,000 in 7 days. That shows you the thirst that Americans have for an accurate and uplifting a curriculum that identifies America has a legacy of resilience and perseverance. And Black America, that's a part of Black American history that is not told, and we're telling it through our curriculum.
Well, thank you for telling it, and I hope it has a lot of success. It seems like many on the left have moved from protesting to just let's tear it up and start over again. That we don't like the founders, we don't like the founding, we don't like the Constitution, and they. I mean, it went much further than people thought it was going to go, and got very, very iconoclastic.
Well, it's even more dangerous than that, because it's as long as we can talk about institutional racism, then it prevents us from asking some very inconvenient questions. For instance, one of the promises of the civil rights movement was that if you vote Black elected officials into office, we will be better to our own people than the whites whose place we took. So these cities where all of these inequities have been accumulating over the past 50 years have been occurred under the leadership of Black Democratic officials. And so the question, I had a chance to debate the leader of Black Lives Matter from New York, and I asked him the same question. I said, well, then if racism is the culprit that has generated these inequities, explain to me why Black children are failing in systems run by their own people. And also all of these police chiefs who they're saying have been hired by people in office who are Black. But you see, is what they've done is really throw the police department under the bus. but it's having, so this is what's really dangerous, and I've never seen this before, that some of these liberal Democratic officials, and that's not a political statement, it's just a statement of fact, that some of these officials, like the mayor of Minneapolis, retreated from a police precinct and allowed the mob to burn it down. I've never seen that before.
Yeah.
The mayor of Portland had to leave his own home because he refused to allow the police to enforce the laws.
Yeah.
And that's very dangerous when the mobs feel as if they can come into a neighborhood and take over a police precinct. I've never seen this happen before, and that's very dangerous.
Yeah, I think we were all shocked with that. You have one sentence in your book, which I'm going to talk about in a little while, and you say, we are witnessing a vast showdown between the Rippers and the Weavers. You know, and I take it as the Rippers are, they want to rip it down, and the Weavers are those who want to weave it back together.
Yeah, see, what is really morally inconsistent about what we are seeing today, that some of the policies that are being advocated by Black Lives Matter and other radical leftists about defund the police, they don't have to live with the consequence of their advocacy because they are not living in those communities where the police. We are working with low-income Black mothers who have lost children to street violence, and they have asked us to bring them together. And they are unanimous by saying they support the police because it is their children that are dying on these streets in record numbers. More Blacks were killed by other Blacks in 1 year than was killed by the Klan over 40 years. And so, but and so the more the police withdraw and are less aggressive in enforcing the laws, the higher the Black on Black murder rate. The fact that police resources are being deployed downtown to respond to rioting means there are fewer police officers enforcing the laws in vulnerable communities. But again, Kamala Harris and others, I made a statement the other day when she's talking about we need to reimagine the police. Well, she should serve by example by dismissing her armed security force and hiring social workers. See, I'd like to see people live by the standards that they advocate. Then I will begin to believe her. When I see her dismiss her security force, I will believe in that we need to reimagine the police. But it's not going to happen.
Bob, I want to go back to Black Lives Matter. Of course, the phrase Black Lives Matter is a phrase, a good phrase. But you are pointing out that it's a movement that's really driven by a very radical leftist agenda. A lot of young people don't make that distinction. Can you explain that just a little bit more for them?
Just look at their website. I mean, they're very explicit. Again, with a lot of young people putting their Black Lives Matter posters up, they don't understand that they're being misled into believing that they are fighting for social justice for Blacks. But Black Lives Matter is using that sincere desire for social justice by taking these sentiments and support, as I said, and migrating them over to burning Bibles, to assault on the nuclear family, and rioting. They are burning down Black businesses as well, which means that they're hostile to capitalism. They want to see socialism, and you hear and so these young people are being misled into, and then the corporations, of course, are funding them. And that's what's fueling it too, that money. So they're using conditions that are deteriorating in the inner city, where there are 20 children under the age of 10 in Chicago alone have been murdered in the course of a year. But it's not front page news. But let one person regardless of the circumstances, that is shot by a police officer. One in Washington had a gun in his hand and they still rioted. Another one in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a black man had a knife coming at the police and was shot and killed. They still demonstrated. So they really aren't seeking to distinguish. They are just trying to undermine the fundamental principles and virtues of our society. And they're using the Black experience as the bludgeon to make this happen.
Bob, a lot of talk has gone on in the news about a critical race theory playing a part in all this. And the president brought it up, but even before the president brought it up, a lot has been written about it and how it's a theory that's driving a lot of what's happening. Can you respond to that? What are your thoughts about critical race theory?
I was really shocked that the moderator at the debates asked Trump, Chris Wallace, asked President Trump, what's wrong with racial sensitivity training? I was shocked. He doesn't understand that critical race theory is not race sensitivity training. Critical race theory is being borrowed from what the Bolsheviks did in Russia during the revolution there. They wanted to collectivize all of the production of food, and the peasants were living peacefully with family, work, and faith. In order to come in and get control, what he had to do is send in his young revolutionaries to begin to promote distinct differences. So they divided into three classes: lower class, middle, and upper, and then began to sow the seeds of dissent. So they began to fight one another. That's exactly what they're doing. They're saying, unlike what Dr. King said, that Americans should be defined by the content of our character, not the color of our skin, they're saying, no, we should all be defined by our skin color. And therefore, all white people are oppressors and have privilege and power, and all Black people and people of color are the victims of this power, and therefore there must be a transfer of power. So it is divisive, it is racist to its core, and it's to be rejected at every turn. Because, and you should read the history of intersectionality. Even the goons that came into Russia during the Bolsheviks used big words. We're doing the same thing, that intersectionality, microaggression. Their parallels are amazing. This is something that students should study at CCU. Look at what the Bolsheviks did and the tactics that they used, and see the comparisons between what was done then and what is being done now.
So there's a lot of crossover with Marxism and the premises of critical race theory. Yeah, what we do
absolutely.
Go ahead.
That critical race theory has just been imposed on what the Bolsheviks did. They're just applying it in the urban setting, but using race as the divider.
I was going to say, we do study history at CCU. In fact, we require the study of history, Western civilization, and American history at CCU. And one of the issues under a lot of these things is people don't study history, so they don't even know about the Bolsheviks and what happened in Russia in 1917, or the Chinese Cultural Revolution, or on and on it goes. And we're judging everything by contemporary perspectives.
They really do. You know, even the French Revolution, where they guillotined the aristocracy and clergy, it's very interesting that the Black Lives Matter was erecting guillotines outside of the homes of wealthy people. I think that was very symbolic. That shows you the similarities between what was done then and what's being done now.
Yeah,
That is more than just coincidental, I think.
I agree with you. It is much more than that. Well, when we talked earlier, Bob, you mentioned that you are coming out with a new book, and it's a book called Lessons from the Least of These. And you said you wanted to spend the bulk of our time talking about positive things, but I wanted to lay the groundwork just because to have you here to hear your thoughts on these things is really important. But you've written many books. I think I've read most of your books, but this one, tell us just a little bit about it.
Well, it's kind of almost a sequel. There it is. It's available for purchase on Amazon. That's my commercial. Pre-order. It will be released December 15th. Good Christmas present.
There you
But
go.
it was really kind of a moral sequel to my book, The Triumphs of Joseph, where I talked about the relationship between the rich and poor, that Joseph was in prison, you know the story, and how, but the good Pharaoh was a person who could dream bad dreams in good times, that he was not impressed with the power and influence that he had, but he was able to look over the horizon and see unforeseen danger coming. But he also had the confidence and good sense to empower a 31-year-old uneducated Hebrew shepherd who was in his prison. He broke all kinds of racial and ethnic barriers because he was convinced, and it wasn't Pharaoh, it wasn't Joseph's God, it was the secular consequence of Joseph's faith that Pharaoh was impressed with. And so he empowered him. And so I use that as a metaphor, and so that's why my whole organization is built. We go into the inner cities and we look for Josephs. We look for the kind of people who were like Joseph's, was wronged and suffered injustice, but never succumbed to bitterness and resentment. He didn't demand reparations from the Egyptians. He entered into a partnership, and together they fed the world, including his own family. And there are other type of Josephs, of those who have fallen, who are prostitutes, who are predators, but through God's grace have become redeemed. And they then are powerful witnesses that redemption was work. It's a Saul to Paul experience that we support. Now, so what I've done now is reflecting on 40 years of my experience of working with the Josephs. I listened to them, I watched them, I studied what is it that explained their process of redemption. And so I've then taken what I've learned and I've written them into the 10 Woodson principles. But everything that I have, I've refined all of my 40 years of experience. I have distilled it into 10 principles that are in the book, Lessons from the Least of These. And so it helps guide people who are really interested in reducing poverty and alienation. And it gives you a guide as to what to look for, how to find a Joseph. And once you find a Joseph, what to do with him.
Bob, I'd like to ask you about some of the underlying concepts in your book. I just read through it today. And one of those concepts that just keeps appearing all through your writings is localism, as opposed to sort of top-down, far-away federalism or something like that. I mean, community-based, grassroots, indigenous. You keep bringing this up. Why is that so important for finding solutions for poverty and race?
That's because, again, entrepreneurs tend to be C students. These are, in other words, it's constructive innovation. Constructive innovation. In other words, the innovation comes from informal. Most entrepreneurs tend to be C students. As I've said before, A students come back to universities and teach, C students endow, because C students are able to act in the presence of their doubts and uncertainty. They're not afraid of failing. They will fail and get up and rebuild. It takes character to rebuild. And so, but that's it. But also there's a very important book that your students should read by James C. Scott. It's called, oh gosh, give him a senior moment. It'll come to me. Seeing Like a State. And
Seeing
in
like
there,
a,
he says
seeing like a what?
Seeing Like a State.
Okay.
SEEING, Seeing Like a State. And what he's a leftist economist at Yale, but he's a very thoughtful book. And what he says is that there are two types of knowledge: episteme knowledge that you can teach at the university, and metis knowledge that is common sense knowledge. He says with episteme knowledge, you can teach a person to navigate a steamship across an ocean. That you can teach in a classroom. But when that steamship gets to the port of Baltimore, the captain turns it over to a harbor master, because that harbor master knows that port, and he knows by common sense experience where the jetties are, where the currents are, and he's able to take it into port. Grassroots people know their community. They know who to trust, how to encourage, how to stop things from happening, how to inspire people to change. Those are the harbor masters. But the same harbor master can't go to the harbor in New York because it requires local. And so a lot of the peace and a lot of the solutions to problems that we have found have abided in a small group of people who are moral mentors and character coaches that are indigenous. The quality that makes them effective makes them invisible, because they're not whining and complaining. They're not picketing anyone. You got to be like a Geiger counter and find them. But we look at life, particularly poor people, through the lens of elitism. We say we see rundown homes, abandoned buildings, cracked sidewalks, and we assume that there's no capacity there at all. And therefore we believe if anything is to happen to rebuild, it must come from the outside. But I go into the worst places and find some of the best people in America who live there by choice and serve.
Localism is.
We are done. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say localism is one of those underlying principles. Another one that I just saw popping up all over the place is self-help programs versus what you've been talking about, victim thinking. There's so much victim thinking. In fact, the critical race theory Marxist, paints people as oppressed, and you're pushing in a different direction here.
Absolutely. There's another interesting paradigm here that Frederick Douglass has touched upon. Your students should study this as well. And that is, Frederick Douglass said that in his Up from Slavery, that the worst time on the plantation was between Christmas and New Year's, because that's when they gave slaves off, free time. But the slave master wanted the slave to define freedom as a freedom from responsibility. Therefore, he gave them a free rum and encouraged the slaves to drink, and they even had contests. And so that the end of, or engage in dissipation. And so they did this because he hoped that the slave at the end of the period of being sick, he'll say, better to be a slave to a man than a slave to rum. But there are other slaves who understood the deception and used that time to visit family or learn to read, or they left and hired themselves out so that they can purchase their freedom. So it was never this external circumstance that defined the outcome for people. It's the choice that they make in that. Well, the left does the same thing today with people on welfare. We separate work from income and tell people, well, you have a right to be cared for. You're exempt from any personal responsibility. Delayed gratification is being white. personal responsibility is whiteness. So, so it's very interesting that liberal and I would say radical leftists today are employing the same strategy that slave masters did to discourage people from being self-sufficient. I think it was Shelby Steele that says, if someone does not know how to live free, they will reinvent their oppression. Or C.S. Lewis said that some of us are locked in a prison where the locks are on the inside. And so, but it'd be interesting for students to study what Douglas was saying and look at some of the tactics and the cultural messages they're communicating to young Blacks in the inner city. If you're robbing and stealing, it's not your fault. It's institutional racism. If you're dropping out of school, it's not your fault. If you're having children out of wedlock, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. Nothing is more lethal than giving people an exemption from personal responsibility.
Wow.
Nothing is more deadly than that.
It disempowers
That's what
them.
we're giving them.
Yeah. It disempowers them, and you're really eloquent in your book when you talk about that. You write, when welfare becomes a right, it conditions us to believe that the cause of and solutions for poverty and other societal issues are beyond their control and lie outside their communities. It perpetrates a victim mentality and disempowers a group of people. Those are your words.
Yes, sir. You read them well.
Yeah. Another concept. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say another concept that's sort of underlying everything is you talk a lot about mediating structures that we've ignored and their importance, and especially the family. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, one of our scholars did some research at 6 major plantations at the end of slavery, and he found 75% of those slave families had a man and a woman raising children. 75%. Even during slavery, we were and that for a century, our families remained intact through all of the days of Jim Crow. Up until the 60s, Black families were whole and in place. And so it was adherence to these moral principles that kept us focused. I'm sorry, I missed just slipped the question for again. So it's the family composition, and that we were able to be.
Well, yeah, it just seems like the family and the nature of the family and fatherlessness are ignored in this whole discussion, and its important place for building stable families.
Well, that's why in the Black community, that's when all of these problems occurred in terms of violence. It's because the absence of the fathers. And Cloward and Piven at the Columbia University School of Social Work in the 60s, they said that one of the ways to expose the inconsistencies and hypocrisy of capitalism is to make it bankrupt. And so what they did with the Black community is remove the stigma of welfare. They said if we can separate work from income, it will mean the father will be redundant, and therefore more people will be go on welfare. And it was supported by the women's movement. It was also supported by the Black Power movement. But just a concept alone wasn't enough. The federal government conspired by opening up offices and actively recruiting Blacks into the welfare system and made those payments more generous than working, so that in a period of like 4 years, millions of Blacks in New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia and Washington poured into the welfare system and making the city of New York broke. But and what he predicted was true. And this occurred in New York when the unemployment rate for Black men was under 4%. So it was not in response to an unemployment crisis, but it was in response to a social policy that was deliberately intended by the left to really use the Black community to bankrupt this of the system. And it would promote, and they even said it's in their book, there'll be increase in drug addiction, dropout rates, all of these social pathology will occur when we were able to do this.
Mm.
And that's in Fred Siegel's book, The Future Once Happened Here, a very, very important book on that subject. The Future Once Happened Here by Fred Siegel at the Manhattan Institute.
I appreciate all these good leads for books. Bob, one other thing that, a couple other things struck me as I was reading your book. And I'd like you to help us understand the different Black responses to racism and poverty. In your book, you call people back to, quote, the old values of the Black community. And another place you call it authentic Black history. And you say, give voice to the Black heritage that was marked by determination, self-sufficiency, achievement, rooted in values like family, religion, patriotism, self-reliance. And you say these are deeply rooted in authentic Black history. It seems like there's a major quarrel going on among Black leaders, and obviously you're I know you're a Christian. I know you're just very articulate. But the progressives are arguing something very different. But you're calling people back to something very deep in the Black experience.
See, I spoke to about 120 young Black MBAs one time at a conference. And I rattled off 10 Black-owned businesses from history. They didn't have knowledge of a single one of them.
Interesting.
They, like others, believed that we were victims of racial oppression and therefore unable to care for ourselves. And so what I've done in my book, On the Road to Economic Freedom, and we do it in these essays, is that we have pictures, we got videos of that when whites were at their worst, Blacks were at their best. When there was about only 25% of Blacks at the end of slavery could read. In less than 40 years, that number increased to 75% could read. This is unheard of in the country. When we were denied access to hotels, we built our own. We went to our church burial societies and built our own major hotels, the Wallahaji in Atlanta, the Carver and Calvert hotels in Miami, the St. Charles in Chicago, the St. Teresa in New York. I could go on and on and on. When we were denied access to our medical schools, we built our own, the Harry Medical Center. And we had our own Black Wall Street in Hayti section of Durham, North Carolina. And in Chicago, we had in the Bronzeville section, in 1929, Blacks owned 731 businesses and 100 million in real estate assets with an out of wedlock birth under 15%. And that was considered scandalous. So in the Greenwood section that was burned down in 1920, there were 5 Black men who owned their own private planes. And so this kind of, we had our own railroad. I'll tell you a funny, an amusing one. The one, Elijah McCoy, was born of fugitive slave parents who went to Canada, and he was educated in Scotland and had an engineering degree. And he came to work in 1843, I think, through the Chicago Railroad. And because he was Black, forget the fact that he has an engine, they gave him the lowliest job and the most dangerous, and that is oiling the wheels on the trains manually. So he invented a machine, a box that would go over the wheel and oil the machine automatically, and became wealthy. And when others tried to copy it, they said, the owners of the railroad said, no, we want the real McCoy.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where that expression comes from, all over the world. Give us the real McCoy. It was named for a Black inventor. He had 51 different inventions to his patents and inventions. And he's in the Inventors Hall of Fame. So they're fascinating stories of Black resilience and perseverance that is a part of America. The very fact that Blacks fought in every war. My father was a veteran of the First World War. And we fought in every war. Not a single Black was ever convicted of treason, because we fought for the promise of America in recognition of its birth defect of slavery and Jim Crow. That's why people of color risk their lives from all over the world to get here to enjoy what America offers that is unique. We love this country, and we are going to fight to preserve it. And that's why we started 1776. We're fighting to preserve this republic, because it is really the land of the free and the home of the brave.
That is just wonderful to hear, and so well said, and encouraging. I hope your voice is heard far and wide. Bob, I want to, before I turn it over to Jeff Hunt, who's going to open a time of questions, in your list of 10 lessons, right, the lessons from the least of these, number 10 on your list is a word, and it's the word grace. And I want to ask you, what part do spiritual solutions play in all that we've been talking about? It seems like it's important to you.
90% of the people that I have served over the last 40 years in these urban neighborhoods attribute their transformation and redemption to Christ. They clearly say, I was lost and then I was found. Absolutely. Let me give you an example from history of what I have another book coming out called Radical Grace. There is a man, if I could, there was a man, Robert Smalls, who was born in 1848, in Sumter, North Carolina. He was a slave, worked on a ship, a supply ship. And he plotted to steal this ship, and he got his crew together. They picked up their families, and he put on his master's coat and his hat and went past 5 Southern garrisons and turned the ship over to the Union Navy. And as a consequence of his brave and he became a national figure, a celebrity. And as a result of that, Abraham Lincoln allowed Blacks to fight in the Civil War. After the war, he became a successful businessman, and doing Reconstruction served several terms in Congress. He made enough money to go back and purchase the plantation on which he was a slave.
Wow.
And also took in the wife and children of the slave master. And because she was delusional, permitted her to sleep in her same master bedroom. That, to me, is an act of radical grace. And there are other stories where Blacks have purchased a plantation in which they were slaves and practiced grace.
Bob, you also
Dr. King did it.
Yeah, I can't wait to read that one too. You mentioned in this section on grace that America is in need of revival, and you kind of close with this. What do you mean by revival? What do you have in mind?
What I have in mind, if race is standing in the way of the moral, of being able to address the moral and spiritual freefall that is consuming people regardless of their age or regardless of their economic circumstance. For instance, in Silicon Valley, where you have two-parent households with parents with master's degrees, median income maybe $180,000, $190,000. That's supposed to be, they have a murder rate of their, a suicide rate among their teens that are 6 times the national average. 6 times. Low-income whites in Appalachia are dying of drug overdose. You have wealthy white kids and entertainers taking their lives overdose. And so I think that the mother of a 17-year-old that lost her daughter to suicide in Silicon Valley, and the Black mother that lost her daughter to homicide in the inner city, they have more in common than they do difference. So we need to really bring about a revival where we are put aside our racial differences and those that would destroy this nation. If we can deracialize race and desegregate poverty as a goal, then we can come together as Americans and find out why there's just such emptiness and lack of moral content in our lives that causes us to want to take the life, either take it or take our own. But we can't come up with an answer to that dilemma if we look at each other through a racial prism. Only when we can come together as people of faith can we answer the question about what fills this empty hole in our lives. I think it was Cain and Abel when he slew his brother. He could have, God could have killed him, but he gave him a fate worse than death. And that is to wander without content or purpose in your life. Nothing is worse than wandering without content or purpose. And we have a lot of young people who are wandering without content and purpose. We must come together as believers across racial and ethnic lines to heal that hurt heart.
Well, I'm going to invite Jeff Hunt to join us right now. I've had the privilege of asking my friend Bob lots of questions that come out of his books and just his life's work. And I know you have some questions, and Jeff's going to be fielding those. So Jeff, over to you.
Absolutely. Well, President Sweeting, thank you so much for hosting this. And Dr. Woodson, I am such a huge fan. There are people that get excited about Bono and Justin Bieber, and I am thrilled to have Dr. Woodson here. I first learned about your work through folks like Robert Rector and Jennifer Marshall at the Heritage Foundation, and you've done fantastic work getting conservatives focused on alleviating poverty and sharing and caring for the poor, and as well as the racial reconciliation work you've done. So thank you so very much for being here. Friends, we have the option to ask questions on the Zoom feature. So click down at the bottom, you'll see Q&A, and you can ask some questions there, and I'll relay it back to Dr. Woodson. I'll start with the first question. Dr. Woodson, you've done tremendous work with folks like Paul Ryan and Jack Kemp to get conservatives thinking about poverty alleviation policies and solutions. As I mentioned, some of our friends at the Heritage Foundation and AEI have done good work in this as well. Share with the folks on this webinar some of the history of your work of getting Republicans and conservatives to focus on compassion for the poor.
Well, I'll tell you, it's been very difficult to convince my conservative friends that they should do more than just write papers and go on Fox TV and complain about what the left is doing. And unfortunately, we have conceded a lot of this ground over the years. There are not many conservatives that have followed the lead of Jack Kemp. And Jack Kemp came to me at a time when it was not politically advantageous to him, because most Republicans and conservatives said, well, they're not going to vote for us, but since they're not going to vote for us, why should we spend our time? But Jack Kemp was motivated by principle to want to come and help people. And so what he did as a member of Congress, he mobilized, when I had a group of residents in public housing that had driven out the drug dealers and wanted to take control and rebuild their own businesses there, Jack Kemp brought, Newt Gingrich was a freshman, Steve Dick Army, and the rest of them. Well, they came out into a low-income community and had congressional hearings to ask low-income people not about their problems, but about their success. And it was such an anomaly that all of the media in Washington came to cover it, because they wanted to know, what are these white conservatives doing coming into a high crime public housing, asking low-income Black people how they solve their problems. And then the Democratic committee chair saw it on television, then he had to come and have hearings. But then Jack Kemp said to me, Bob, you have 7 amendments to the Housing Act, but the Republicans are in a minority. But if you recruit 1 Democrat, I'll get you 100 Republicans. So I recruited Walter Fauntroy, and he came together and co-sponsored my amendments. And this is when I met Bill Armstrong, when he was a senator from Colorado. I approached Bill Armstrong, who was also a conservative who cared about the poor, and said, Bob, sign me up. Well, I paired him with Alan Dixon, liberal from Illinois, and they co-sponsored in the Senate. And it passed 93-0 in the Senate, 430 in the House, and we signed it. I thought that that was going to be the beginning of a conservative emphasis on outreach, but unfortunately, not many conservatives followed Jack Kemp's lead. And instead, so I have been an irritant among conservatives, telling them they need a ground game. They need to go out and talk to the people they write about. But that's been a hard sell. But I think it's changing now. I hope it is. But the reason that we have this problem is that we're not showing up.
I think one of the reasons we love Colorado Christian universities, we have all these young minds and up and coming leaders. One of those up and coming leaders among Jack Kemp's legacy was Paul Ryan. And I know you were very close with Speaker Paul Ryan. I met with Speaker Paul Ryan when he laid out kind of his poverty and opportunity agenda. And I know you were working closely with him. What do you feel like you were able to achieve with Paul Ryan? What was still left on the table? What would you like to see conservatives still working on with regards to poverty alleviation?
Well, you know, what I'd like to see conservatives learn from those that have been successful. Paul Ryan approached me right during the campaign and asked me, could I bring together some people in Ohio that he could talk to? And I'll tell you a secret. I thought that this was the Republicans' attempt to get a photo out with some Black folks. So I brought about 18 white community leaders together with just 2 Blacks. You know, and so when Paul comes into the room and you see these white guys with tattoos on their arm driving their Harley Davidson outside, and they told the Secret Service, oh, I'm with Bob. They said, you with Bob? I said, yeah. I said, yeah, he's with me, come on. So we were sitting around the table and they were so uptight. And when we started to share with Paul Gradell, one of my guys from Elyria with his jacket on, he says, Bob, can we pray with Paul, put our hands on him? And when at the end of that hour, we all gathered around and Paul Gradell prayed over Paul Ryan. I saw tears in the eyes of the Secret Service at the end of that session. And from that day on, Paul was convicted. He called me. He wrote personal notes to every one of those 20 men and women.
Wow.
After the election's over. Usually politicians forget those, but this was after the election they had lost. He said, Bob, can you take me out to see? And so I took him for every month for 2 years. I took him around quietly all over the country to meet low-income leaders.
That's great. I mean, he really was a leader and a champion for those issues. And I think we need to make sure we're continuing to advocate for those policies as conservatives. One of the questions we
But there's one more book.
Go ahead.
Excuse me. There's one more book students should read about a successful Republican conservative in politics. It's Dick Riordan. And he has a book called The Mayor. The Mayor. Dick Riordan is a conservative Republican in 1990, went to East LA, a low-income Hispanic neighborhood, and worked with a Jenny Lichtenberg, who was a liberal Democratic nun. She had an after-school program there, but Dick recruited some of his friends and built a state-of-the-art facility there. And 2 years after that, he declared for the mayor, and he won. First Republican in 35 years, because he understood that if you plant charitably, you can harvest politically, but you don't harvest and plant in the same year.
Yeah. I mean, you've noticed, conservatives and Republicans tend to just show up when it's election time as opposed to spending those.
Exactly. That was the point. And he articulates, and he ran for re-election. He won by 60% of most of the demographics in the city when it hadn't happened in 35. You would think Republicans would rush there to find out how he did it, but they didn't.
One of the questions we have here has to do with fatherhood and the breakdown of the family that's happened among inner city communities. You have kids that are growing up without dads and therefore learning that dads don't need to be present. And it just perpetuates a cycle of broken families. How do we change that? How do we encourage change in that area?
The way we did it, we have to come up with surrogate fathers. So when we went into Benning Terrace, an area of southeast Philadelphia, southeast Washington, where there were 53 murders in a 5 square block area in 2 years, I worked with a group of Christian ex-offenders called the Alliance of Concerned Men. And they went up into that community and brought these warring factions to my office, just 16 young men. And they negotiated a truce. And then afterwards, 40 of the young men came to the table and decided, and we put them to work rebuilding the community they were tearing up. And the housing authority helped by employing them. But we said to these young men, this is not charity. We did some things for you. You have to give back to the community that you took from. What are you passionate about? And they said, we wanted to be coaches. So we made them coaches, and some of them have been volunteering for 20 years. And they then were surrogate coaches, are surrogate fathers and big brothers to these kids. And you should see, we took hundreds of these kids to Orlando with these coaches. Once you take a young man who changed his life around from a predator to ambassadors of peace, and you give him responsibility for younger children, he is able to stay with that child and become a surrogate father. And as a result, we had peace for 12 years. We went from 12 murders in a 5 square block area in 2 years down to 0 gang murders for 12 years. And that's because the next generation that came through were fathered by those boys. We can do this all over the country. We got to come up with alternatives.
That's very encouraging and powerful. And I hope the students here at CCU are learning about it, the importance of engagement in those communities, of developing that surrogate father relationship, and being present. It goes a long way to alleviating poverty. And I know, especially among our younger students, the concerns of justice, wanting to reach out to these communities, bring hope and help to these communities is something that's very powerful, especially among our students here at CCU. So that's wonderful.
Let me say, I want to say a word about how one serves.
Yes.
There was a shelter in, I think I mentioned in my book, in Washington. There was a shelter for women, and every Christmas, volunteers would buy toys for the kids and give them to the kids at Christmas. Everybody was happy but the moms. So the next year, the director of the program permitted to and encouraged the women to work, to volunteer and earn toy vouchers. And then the toys that were collected were put in a store. And then at the Christmas party, the mothers went in and shopped for their own children. And they were happier at the Christmas party because they had earned the money to do. So that's a very important ingredient when you're helping people. Do whatever you can to enable them to help themselves. Don't always come in because you see a need and reach into your pocket and give somebody something. Give them an opportunity to earn what they give. Reciprocity is one of the Woodson principles that we should enable people to give back for what they receive. It doesn't have to be in kind, or they can give to somebody else. They don't have to give to you. But we really think that the way you maintain a person's dignity is give them an opportunity to be a blessing to someone else.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Woodson. Another question here has to do with the president's prison reform efforts, some of the efforts that are coming out of New York City, like bail reform. There is a pretty big population that's in prison compared to other countries. What are your thoughts on the efforts to bring about prison reform, reducing recidivism, to help people lift out of poverty?
I really think that I believe in prison reform, but it should not be blanket amnesty the way it's being interpreted in New York City. It's being used as a political tool. Even Black Lives Matter had one demand that all Black violent offenders be given a retrial. And so I just think there are extremes on all sides. I am a very close friend of the gentleman, John Ponder, that the president pardoned. Because he was a bank robber, but he had been out for many years, and he made it possible for 3,000 other people to be blessed. So I think in situations where we're very selective and be very careful, that if someone like the woman he pardoned, who got life for a small drug deal or something like that, I think we need to be very careful and selective about what we mean when we say prison reform.
You know, one of the things that we've noticed here in Colorado with the commercialization of marijuana is that marijuana is following the same pathway that liquor stores are. And so oftentimes in inner city communities, you'll have liquor stores, you'll have marijuana shops. You're not finding marijuana shops in white suburban communities. They seem to be targeting those inner city communities as well. Do you have any thoughts on the kind of drug decriminalization, the drug commercialization effort that's happening across this country?
I think I'm against giving moral sanction to any kind of drugs like that. I just don't believe it. But I do think sometimes there are elements of racism when I see those things happening only in certain communities. I'm suspect. It's just like in Washington, D.C., when they started the lotteries, the low-income Black communities were the place where they put up the lotteries, and the subway stops were not in the community. You know, so sometimes when I'm not altogether believe that racism is is absent in America. I believe there are some decisions, but it's hard to distinguish sometimes between race and class, because a disproportionate number of Blacks are poor. Anything that affects class affects race. And so I think, but we have to be very careful in assigning it. But I'm solution oriented. And when someone says to me, oh, that's the problem of systemic racism, then they need to be asked, well, tell me what the solution is. And tell me how that solution has the consequence of saving a Black life in the community. So we shouldn't stop at just letting people say, oh, it's too strict. Make them tell you what their remedy is for it then. Never just accept the fact that that problem is because of systemic racism. Okay, what's your solution for it?
One of the messages that came out through the summer was the request for white people to listen to the stories of what's happening to the Black community. That was one of the strong messages out of Black Lives Matter. And you had senators like Tim Scott who were saying, listen, I'm getting pulled over in Washington, D.C. regularly simply for just driving a nice car and being a Black man. Do you think that there is a call to the white community to listen to the stories of Black community? Maybe not systemic racism, but problems that are happening out there?
Well, I really think that when you have a situation where Blacks are 45% of the population, and there are 57 people robbed on the subway system in Washington, they're all young Black men. There are 130 violent carjackings, all by young Black men. It would not surprise me if there was not some profiling. But the profiling isn't necessarily race, it's race and acts and experience. And so that's what I'm talking about. But I don't think what Senator Scott said was very helpful. I didn't agree with him saying that. I mean, I have been discriminated against on United Airlines in first class. When I was sitting there with my wife flying back from Hawaii, and the flight attendant came around to the seat in front of me and asked people, do you want steak or chicken? But she stopped at my wife, and I went around the other side and asked the same question to all of the other white guests. And then she came back to me and my wife, and she said, all we got left is chicken. And I said to her, well, then you have a problem, because I want steak. And I wasn't loud, I was just disciplined. And so the head flight attendant, an older woman, came to me, and we were very quiet, and said, she's embarrassed. I said, she should be embarrassed. She should be. She said, Mr. Woodson, Mrs. Woodson, we'll get you steak. I said, thank you. I meant the pilot was going to eat chicken. Now, even though that happened, I don't think it would have been responsible for me riding in first class, coming back from Hawaii, to make myself a cause celeb on racial discrimination. It's a bit much. It happened, okay, but I don't want to add to those that exploit it. You have several, a Princeton professor and another walking by Black. She claims that she was stopped and found out that it wasn't true. And so you have people trying to exploit the sensitivity to make the implication that police officers are discriminating, man.
As we wrap up here, we've just got a few more minutes left. One of the questions brought up to Joe Biden during the presidential debate was that Antifa was just a myth. And when you look at what's happening in communities where you're facing a lot of violence, you're facing a lot of rioting, looting that's taking place, it often doesn't seem to be coming from the Black community. It seems to be coming from white liberals associating with Antifa. Do you believe Antifa is a myth, or are they really
No,
doing
sir.
inner city community?
I think they are fascist. I think they're radical. I think they're anarchist, particularly those that have a Harvard degree in one hand and a Molotov cocktail in another, screaming at a Black woman that she ain't Black enough. That's my image of a radical Antifa person as they're getting ready to throw a cocktail through a Black-owned business. That's my stereotype of an Antifa.
Right. Well, and they're bringing harm to these communities. I think we've all seen those videos where they're yelling at Black police officers, and that's heartbreaking. And I think, Dr. Woodson, you and I have been in the conservative movement. We have a lot of Black conservative friends who have faced tremendous name calling from white liberals, and that's hard to see. That's heartbreaking.
Well, unfortunately, I haven't had that experience.
Yeah.
I know that I was being castigated at a banquet many years ago by the speaker, and I wasn't there. And 3 of my grassroots leaders got up off the dais and walked out. So I'm fortunate, I guess, that I keep hoping that someone would picket me so I can get more attention to what I'm saying, but it hasn't happened yet. Maybe there's still hope, though, in the future.
Well, I am so grateful for the work. You really have guided the conservative movement. Lots of conservatives that are in public policy, from the Heritage Foundation and AEI, and it really encouraged conservatives to get in the game, and not sit on the sidelines when it comes to helping the inner city community achieve the American dream. Because I think that's a lot of the challenge that we see in the racial tension we're facing in this country, is that we don't. If there's injustice, we want to address it. But the flip side of that coin is we want these communities to thrive, and there's not a lot of conversation happening in that direction. What policies need to be implemented to help these communities thrive and get the government out of the way, so that these people can live really good lives. And I'm grateful for the influence and the wisdom you provide for that. So, Dr. Sweeting,
well, thank you.
Just about out of time, so I'll turn it back over to you here.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Dr. Bob Woodson, thank you so much for being our guest. It's great to see you. Thank you for sharing your deep perspectives on race, poverty in a way that is life affirming and opens the door to opportunity. To learn more about Bob Woodson and the Woodson Center, go to woodsoncenter.org, and you can see all the different projects they're involved in, especially 1776 Unites. And then if you're looking for a book for Christmas, Lessons from the Least of These, The Woodson Principles by Bob Woodson. So I guess my closing word is, in the showdown between rippers and weavers, be a weaver like Bob. And thanks, my friend, and good night, everybody.
Good night.